the Delta Force's unbreakable survival act spring of 2001. Months before anyone outside a handful of agencies had ever heard the words War on Terror. A couple of Air Force Special Operations guys walked into a small blacksmith shop in Tennessee and asked for something no factory was building anymore, a fighting axe. Not a hardware store hatchet, not a wall hanger, something you could trust with your life. The guy who took that order was still in his 20s. He'd been forging blades since he was 12 years old. And what he built over the next few months would end up carried into the mountains of Afghanistan before that same year was over, riding along on some of the earliest missions of a war that hadn't even been declared yet when the design left his bench. That's not a marketing story. That's the actual timeline. And it's the reason this thing has spent the last 2 decades collecting one of the strangest reputations in the entire survival and tactical world. Half battlefield legend, half internet myth. Today we're finding out how much of it is real. Now you'll see this tool advertised as being carried by SEALs, Delta Force operators, Marine Raiders, Army Special Forces, and it might be. But here's the problem with verifying that. Delta doesn't publish gear lists. Nobody's releasing a procurement memo confirming which specific Tomahawk a specific unit is carrying on a specific deployment. Companies know this. And unnamed operators carry our gear is about the easiest, unverifiable claim in the entire industry. So instead of taking the marketing at face value, let's look at what we can actually confirm, because the confirmed part of this story is honestly wilder than the rumor. The company is a small American shop, and the founder is a career bladesmith who grew up obsessed with old edged weapons, Japanese swords first, then frontier-era tomahawks. When those Air Force operators came to him in 2001, they gave him a specific problem to solve, not a wish list. They wanted something that combined the geometry of an 18th century fighting tomahawk with modern steel and modern manufacturing, light enough to carry without thinking about it, strong enough that failure wasn't a possibility they wanted to consider. His answer was to forget the idea of an axe head, bolted or wedged onto a wooden handle entirely. Instead, he cut the head and the handle from a single piece of steel. One continuous piece of bar stock, shaped, ground, and heat-treated as a single unit, with the grip scales added afterward purely for comfort, not for structure. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, and we're going to come back to it because it's both the best and the most limiting decision in the entire design. By the fall of that year, American forces were on the ground in Afghanistan, and this Tomahawk was already there with them. Not as a prototype, as a working tool in a war zone within months of being designed. That's the part of the story that doesn't need Delta Force attached to it to be impressive. Worth pausing on why anyone wanted a Tomahawk in the first place, in an era of rifles, drones, and precision-guided everything. The Tomahawk isn't new technology pretending to be old. It's genuinely old technology that never really left. Frontier fighters carried them for the same reason special operations units still do now. A rifle jams, runs dry, or simply isn't the right tool for the 10 seconds you're actually in. A blade on the end of a handle doesn't jam. It doesn't need a magazine change. And a hooked, bearded edge can do things in a doorway or a stairwell that a straight blade can't. Catch a limb, catch a weapon, catch a door frame, and pull yourself through it. That's 300 years of field-proven physics, not a marketing angle. So let's talk about what unbreakable actually means here, because that word gets thrown around by every gear company on the internet, and most of the time it's nonsense. The head is roughly 7 inches, cut from steel around 3/8 of an inch thick. Some versions run even thicker. That's a chunk of metal that would feel almost absurd in a knife. In an axe head, it means the edge geometry can afford to be aggressive without the head flexing or cracking under repeated impact. The steel itself is a tough, shock-resistant alloy, the same family of steel you'll find in industrial punches and cold chisels, tools whose entire job is getting hit hard, over and over, without chipping. That's not an accident. That's the same logic that goes into designing something meant to punch through a door, a wall, or a windshield, and come out the other side ready to do it again. Then there's the geometry. One edge is a straight, aggressive cutting bit. The other side tapers out into a long spike, not a hammer pole like you'd find on a splitting maul, a genuine spike, designed to punch through sheet metal, shatter tempered glass, or bite into concrete and mortar. Somewhere along that same profile, the cutting edge curves back into what's called a beard, an extended hook-shaped section of blade that lets you catch and pull, not just chop straight down. The steel gets heat-treated into a specific hardness range. Call it the high 50s on the Rockwell scale, if that means anything to you. If it doesn't, here's the plain version. Harder steel holds an edge longer, but gets brittle and can chip under shock. Softer steel bends before it breaks, but dulls fast. Sitting in the high 50s is a deliberate middle ground, hard enough to keep an edge through serious use, soft enough that the head absorbs a bad hit by deforming slightly instead of cracking. That's not the hardness you'd want on a straight razor. It's exactly the hardness you'd want on something that's going to get swung at concrete by mistake at some point in its life. Here's where the tool starts developing an actual identity instead of just being a tomahawk. Most axes are built to do one thing, cut wood, and they're optimized entirely around that job. This thing was built around a completely different question. What does a small team need when the plant changes in half a second? Breach a door, cut a seat belt, break a window from the outside, pry a hinge, dig fast, chop when you have to. It's not trying to be the best tool at any single one of those jobs. It's trying to be the tool you'd rather have than nothing when you genuinely don't know which of those jobs is coming next. That's the personality that emerges here, not a wood axe pretending to be tactical gear, but a breaching and emergency tool that happens to be axe-shaped. Keep that distinction in your head because it's going to matter a lot later in this video. Now, is it actually tough enough to earn the reputation? This is where the one-piece steel construction starts paying off in a way a hafted axe simply can't match. On a traditional axe, the single most common failure point isn't the edge, it's the handle. Wood splits, fiberglass cracks at the collar, even the head itself can loosen and fly off mid-swing if the wedge fails, which, if you've ever had it happen, is one of the more unsettling things that can occur mid-swing. With an integral design, there is no head-to-handle connection to fail, because there's no separate handle, it's one part. You could theoretically use this thing to pry, battenize wood, hammer a stake, dig through frozen ground, and swing full force into a knot of hardwood, and the thing that's most likely to give out first is your grip strength, not the tool. That's a genuinely different failure profile than almost anything else in this category, and it's the part of the unbreakable reputation that actually checks out under scrutiny. Naturally, this kind of claim doesn't survive on paper alone. It survives because people keep trying to break it on camera. Over the years, this thing has been chopped through car doors, hacked into cinder block, driven through windshields, and used to pry open steel drums. And there's a whole cottage industry of outdoor and tactical channels doing exactly that kind of abuse testing. Some of it is legitimate stress testing. A fair amount of it is the same thing that's happened to almost every indestructible product since infomercials existed. Someone finds the most photogenic way to hit something with it, and durability becomes theater. That doesn't make the underlying steel any weaker. It just means you should watch these tests for what they actually demonstrate, not for how satisfying the impact sounds. There's also a specific story that gets repeated often enough in gear circles that it's worth mentioning, with the right amount of caution attached. The company has talked publicly about a call they received from a service member whose team was reportedly pinned down and used one of these tomahawks to chop an escape route through a concrete wall. It's the kind of story that's genuinely moving if it happened exactly as described. And it's also a story told secondhand by the manufacturer without an independently verifiable source. That doesn't mean it's false. It means it belongs in the same category as most operator saved by our gear stories, plausible, unconfirmed, and worth remembering as an anecdote rather than treating as documented fact. But, and this is where the story gets more interesting than a simple durability flex, that same one-piece construction creates a real problem. Two of them, actually. First, shock. Wood handles exist partly because wood flexes. It absorbs vibration. When you drive a wooden-handled axe into a hard knot or accidentally clip something you didn't mean to, some of that shock gets soaked up by the handle before it reaches your hand. An all-steel handle doesn't do that. Every mishit, every hard strike into frozen wood or rock transmits straight up your arm. Guys who've put serious hours behind these tools will tell you the same thing. After enough repetitive chopping, you feel it in your wrists and elbows in a way you never would with a traditional wood-hafted axe. Second, and this one matters even more for a survival tool specifically, if a wooden handle ever does break out in the field, you can carve a replacement from a decent hardwood sapling with nothing but the tool itself and some time. People have been doing exactly that for as long as axes have existed. With an integral steel design, there is no handle to replace, because there's also no handle to replace it with. If the tool is ever genuinely damaged, bent under real abuse, or the edge chipped beyond field repair, you are not fixing that with materials found in the woods. You are done using that tool until you get back to civilization. So here's the honest tension at the center of this thing. The exact design decision that makes it nearly impossible to break through normal use is the same decision that makes it non-repairable if it ever is broken. That's not a flaw the company advertises. It's also not one they can really get around because it's baked into the entire concept. Does that actually matter? Depends entirely on the mission it was built for. For a breaching team clearing a structure, that trade-off is basically irrelevant. They're not stranded in a forest for 2 weeks. They're carrying a tool designed for short, violent, high-force tasks. Kick a door, punch a wall, cut a strap, where total structural integrity under repeated hard impact matters infinitely more than field repairability. In that context, this design isn't a compromise. It's exactly correct. For a backcountry hiker who's 20 miles from the trailhead and needs a lightweight tool that can process firewood for 2 weeks straight without wrecking their wrist, it's a different conversation. That short, aggressive cutting edge, under 3 inches on most versions, isn't built for efficient wood processing the way a longer camp axe bit is. And the shock transmission that barely registers during a short, adrenaline-driven breach becomes a real annoyance 3 hours into batoning firewood on night 4 of a trip. Weight tells the same story from a different angle. Fully kitted with a sheath, you're carrying somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 pounds of steel on your belt or pack. Not enormous, but noticeably more than a lightweight backpacking hatchet built from a fraction of the material. For a short deployment where the tool might get used in one violent 10-second window, that weight is a rounding error. For a multi-day hike where every ounce gets felt by mile 8, it's a real line item in your pack list. Price tells a similar story. This isn't a $30 hardware store hatchet, and a big part of what you're paying for is a manufacturing process and steel selection built around surviving abuse most users will genuinely never put it through. This is the same lesson that applies to basically every piece of gear with a military pedigree, and it's worth saying plainly. A tool being combat-proven doesn't automatically make it the correct tool for your specific situation. It means it excelled at the specific problem it was built to solve. Your problem might be a different problem entirely. So where does that leave the unbreakable claim? Under the kind of abuse it was actually designed for, repeated hard impacts, forced entry, digging through frozen or compacted ground, prying, striking unpredictable surfaces without warning, the integral steel construction genuinely holds up in a way conventional axes structurally cannot. That's not hype. That's a direct result of removing the single, most common failure point in axe design. If you're grading it against its actual design mission, the reputation is earned. Under the kind of abuse a backcountry survivalist puts a tool through, hours of repetitive wood processing, weight-conscious long carries, needing field repairability as a genuine backup plan, it's a capable tool, but not obviously the best one for the job. It'll do the work, It'll just make you feel it doing that work more than a purpose-built camp axe would. So who should actually put one of these on their belt? If you're building a bug-out kit, a vehicle emergency kit, or a home defense and disaster combination tool, where the scenario might involve forced entry, breaking glass, or prying something open under stress, this is very close to the ideal shape for that job, and the reputation genuinely earns its keep. If you're a dedicated backpacker whose primary need is efficient firewood processing over multiple days with minimal pack weight, you'll likely be happier and less fatigued with a purpose-built, lightweight hatchet. And you can put the money towards something else in your kit. And if you just want a rugged, good-looking tool that can comfortably do a bit of everything without specializing in any one job, camp chores, light chopping, prying, an occasional worst-case scenario. This sits almost exactly in that middle lane, which is probably the single biggest reason it's stayed popular for over 20 years, instead of fading into a niche military curiosity. And the Delta Force question? Here's the honest answer. The documented history, a small shop, an Air Force Special Operations request in the spring of 2001, and the tool riding into Afghanistan that same fall, is real, and it's independently more interesting than the marketing needs it to be. Whether a specific unit like Delta is currently carrying a specific model of this specific tool is something that lives in the same unverifiable space as most special operations gear claims. Companies in this space have every incentive to let that ambiguity work in their favor, and the wise move as a buyer is to separate this tool has genuine documented combat pedigree from this exact unit currently uses this exact tool, because only one of those two claims can actually be checked. So here's the Ranger rule that actually matters here, and it applies to a lot more than just this one tool. Don't buy a piece of gear because of the unit rumored to carry it. Figure out the actual problem that gear was built to solve. Then ask yourself honestly whether that's your problem too. A tool built to survive violent, unpredictable, high-force use in a breach is going to look completely different from a tool built to process firewood efficiently for 2 weeks in the backcountry, even if, on a shelf, they look almost identical. This one earned its reputation. Just make sure you're buying it for the mission it was actually built for, and not the one attached to it by rumor.